I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present and any Indigenous people in the room today. I've called this presentation Seeing the Invisible, and picking up on a bit of a riff, because adult learners are so much more than second chance learners. These are people whose resilience as learners is well honed, and yet they are weighted down by past learning traumas. This is the invisible. My fellowship explored the possibilities that educators can implement new ways of teaching with the possibility of creating real change and successful learning experiences for adult literacy students by borrowing from neuroscience and therapeutic practices. We can use these theories and practice to inform our pedagogy, or andragogy if you please, and build safe and relationally based learning spaces. I can pinpoint the moment this curious journey for me began. I was approached by a student who came to me and complained that her teacher was wanting her to move on. She said that her teacher said, "You can go and get a job, you've got the skills, you're ready." And she heard this as a criticism. She heard it as if the teacher wanted to get rid of her. So I went and spoke with the teacher, and she said, "Yeah, she's great. She's ready to get a job. It'd be great for her to go out into employment." So I began to wonder, what was it about the way this piece of information was communicated and the way it was received? What was that gap in there? I knew that other students would hear that information as positive, and they would say, "Wow, my teacher said that I'm ready to move on and get a job," and that this student, let's call her Lucy, was upset. And I wondered how we could teach differently and make more of a relational overlap between the teacher and the student, rather than a chasm of misunderstanding. So who are adult literacy learners? Learning traumas. I want to acknowledge at this point that many of us have experienced traumas. Probably everyone. Breakups, death of a loved one, accidents, and we all have adaptive behaviours that have helped us cope with these. These adaptive behaviours are no longer necessary, but they've become wired in our brains. If you think of our brains like a roadmap, they're the behaviours that are wired in there. To rewire our brains, we need to replace old behaviours with new behaviours. So if you've experienced the classroom as a negative learning environment and your adaptive behaviour was to avoid doing work by mucking around or withdrawing, then clearly as an adult student, you need to change that behaviour. It's hard to change that behaviour if your teacher is still behaving in the way your teachers did back when those learning traumas began. So if teachers are having the classroom set up in the same way, rows of seats, and if the roll is called in the same way, the teacher marks the work with a red pen and students are called on to read. These are really simple, everyday teaching behaviours, but they're enough to trigger someone's anxiety and learning traumas. Not all adults with literacy issues seek out adult learning environments, nor do they need to. I'm pretty sure everyone in this room could think of someone in their lives who are very successful in whatever they're doing, who have major spelling issues or have difficulty reading. But those who do often have negative learning experience, which I call learning traumas. Safe learning environments can be created in many different ways, providing safety through structure, consistency, agency, information about the big picture and the details. Teachers who use strength-based methods of working with students are creating a space for learners to experience themselves as successful learners. So adult literacy students, are people who have had negative experiences of learning. Perhaps they've had interrupted schooling. Maybe today they're dealing with addictions, or they have dealt with their parents' addictions when they've been younger, abuse issues. Today they may have bill stress and food insecurity, health issues, and perhaps they're carers or they were carers as children for older family members. So if any of these are happening, it's really difficult for someone to come into a learning space and have successful learning experiences. By just understanding a little bit about how the brain works, we have enough knowledge to understand some of the big theories of neuroscience and enough to make changes based on this knowledge. The oldest part of the brain is the reptilian brain. It's located in the limbic system where the amygdala is there. Can everyone see that okay? Take that as a yes. It's the oldest part of the brain and is among the earliest parts of the brain to develop in the embryo. It's located near the brainstem and connects us to the autonomic nervous system. This is the part of the brain that is responsible for flight, fight and freeze. It tells us when to run when we're in mortal danger. This part of the brain is scanning for danger every 15 seconds. It keeps us alert, and if you're someone whose experience of the learning environment has been negative and a place of threat, the reptilian brain is on every time you enter a classroom. Super on. The other part of the brain that I want to talk about is the prefrontal cortex, which is the yellow part up there. And it's the place where we seek community and connection. It's the optimal place for learning. Mammals, just by definition, are nurturers. This was the last part of the brain to develop. It's the newest part. Teachers need to strive to be in this place with students, to bring a safe emotional space and optimal learning environment. We need to feel safe and have our prefrontal cortex in charge to be open to learning. So it's really important that when we welcome students into our classes, we welcome them into an environment that is welcoming and that is nurturing. Thank you, yes. And that students know that they can relax and be in an optimal learning space. If you think about Lucy, who came to me earlier in the earlier slide, where was she coming from when her teacher told her she could get a job? Was her reptilian brain or mammalian brain on? Educators can make a difference. We know from neuroscience that brains are plastic and can be rewired. Attachment trauma can affect the way we relate to others. Emotional regulation can go up and down on a sliding scale, depending on how safe we feel. Mindset and mindsight can make a big difference. And as educators, we can learn about these theories and embed them in our practice. Attachment. Attachment theory refers to the theory made famous by John Bowlby. That is, if the primary caregiver is attuned to the infant at least 70% of the time, the infant will go on to have mostly secure relationships with others all their lives. If the caregiver wasn't attuned or there enough to meet the infant's needs, they would develop one of two insecure attachment systems. These are dismissive and insecure. So if we think about students who have the insecure attachment styles, it would look like students who just couldn't care less about what was going on in class and it's sort of, whatever. And on the other hand, it might be a student who is so anxious to please the teacher that she or he might copy out a whole bunch of work and hand it in to look like they've done the right thing. So if we can get teachers to understand themselves as attachment figures and know how to attune to their students by doing things like greeting them by name as they enter the classroom, encouraging students to address each other by name, really, really simple things, and treating each other as if they matter, and just really being interested in them and getting to know the students. It can make a really, really big difference. Emotional regulation. If I can just show you this, and I'll hand one out for people to look at a bit closer. So that can go one way or the other. It's an emotional regulation chart that we can all do as individuals. It's really useful to do, and we can introduce that as a learning tool in our classes as well. So you plot on there where you feel comfortably emotionally and things that make you want to leave the room or leave, zone out, or make you anxious. So in that way, we can have our students understand when they're feeling a bit dysregulated, and they know how to ask for help. At which point do they need to ask for help? So if we get sweaty palms when the teacher says there'll be an assessment next week, what do we need to do to stay calm? What can teachers do to support students to stay calm? Again, safe learning spaces. Students might sit in a circle rather than in rows. I think I have a bit of a bugbear about rows. I think they're quite isolating. And maybe talking about what assessment meant in the past and what it means now. Mind sight is the ability to be aware of your own emotional space. Let me click onto that. And hold someone else's at the same time. So it's like if a student came to me this morning, I was really busy and didn't have much time to see her, but she was really upset. So I was able to just hold my anxieties and my panic about getting things done and just be present for her because I knew she needed me to. So that's an example of mind sight. Mindset. There's two different ways we can look at mindset. It's the fixed mindset and the growth mindset. This is from Carol Dweck's work that Karen, thanks, was talking about before. So we want our students to be in a growth mindset where they think and act as though everything is learnable and teachable. We do that by focusing on learning strategies rather than outcomes, and learning to learn tools, and asking questions like, what are you good at? How did you get good at that? What lights you up? And lastly, mirror neurons, also called emotional contagion, which I think is a really great descriptor. The bits in our brains that make us yawn when others yawn. And if you've ever fed a baby, you'll know that as you're driving that spoon towards the baby's mouth, your own mouth opens, wanting to mirroring the behaviour you want the baby to mimic. Lastly, vulnerable learners have so much to deal with when they come into an adult learning space. They need to have time to learn and to not be pressured by restrictions on their hours. These soft skills that we've been talking about today will allow them to develop the abilities to have their prefrontal cortex activated more and more when they enter the classroom and in a safe and optimal learning space. Adult literacy students deserve more. Their resilience at getting up time and time again shows us that they are strong, they have grit, and they're brave. Their neural pathways can be changed by giving them opportunities to experience real learning successes. in safe and relationally based classrooms. We know that learning can be safe and that great learning-based relationships can make a difference. We know that learning became a threat at some point for many adult literacy students, that when they enter a classroom their amygdala is on, and that many classrooms are set up to reinforce those traumas without meaning to. We're going to change the narrative of the classroom and thereby change the narrative of the adult literacy student. New brain pathways, new learning pathways, new successes.